So welcome to another edition of the Metamorphosis lecture series hosted by the East-West Psychology Department at California Institute of Integral Studies. We are very honored to be hosting a talk by Sara Granovetter. She is a student of Zen and a Buddhist-informed depth psychotherapist, as well as adjunct faculty at CIIS. She has a deep interest in our evolving relationship with the more than human world. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Sara, who will give a talk presentation with some image slides, followed by a question and answer. You can type your questions into the chat if you'd like, or raise your hand using the raising hand function in reactions. And I will organize and field these questions as they come in for Sara, and we will conclude with that discussion. Okay, so Sara, welcome to the series. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you for that beautiful music. It was very centering and calming. What a great way to start this talk. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm excited to talk today a bit about the wild other, about untamed alterity within the self and out in the world. And so at the beginning, and I'm just going to read this quote once more. It was in the flyer that you all received. And this is something that Bill Plotkin says on page 26 of Soulcraft. What all three have in common, soul, spirit, and nature, is their wild otherness, the fact that they are indisputably beyond what we can create or control or claim as possession. And so, with that beautiful articulation, I want to say that this talk is about moving into a realization that we cannot create, control, claim, or possess this wild otherness. So this talk is ultimately, in a way, about relationship, a relationship that's not often spoken of. This relationship with wild alterity that's constantly being worked through and refined within us and also within the world. And this talk is also about a radical revisioning of what this relationship entails. And so, in that sense, I want to say that self-realization is a process of mustering the immense courage and humility that it takes to come into and refine our relationship with wild otherness in the self and in the world. But as we'll come to see through the oxherding pictures, those two relationships aren't actually separate. There's not actually a dividing line between the wild otherness in the self and in the world. And so I also want to say that this self-realization is also necessary for the evolution and survival of collective humanity. We depend upon a radical reorientation of the ego towards that which we consider wild and beyond reason. So let me just say briefly before I begin, let me just talk a little bit about what do I mean when I say wild alterity? What do I mean by wild otherness within the self? And so there's so many ways to name and define the wild other, and we see traces of the wild other in so many spiritual and psychological concepts. And so in this talk, I'm going to mine the frameworks of Jungian scholars and the Zen Buddhist wisdom of the 10 oxherding pictures with a little touch of psychoanalysis. And so wild otherness is the non-rational, non-conceptual, mysterious stirrings within us, the parts of us that are not us, that behave in ways that are mysterious to our sense of kind of a rationalist aesthetic, to our sense of reason, that seems senseless. Some might just call it the unconscious, but I want to say that there's more here. And so the wild other also refers to the disowned and alienated aspects of the human self, portions of the personality that the ego registers as strange or alien. And so this self within us, it's the self within us that seems to behave autonomously and just can't seem to be encompassed in dominant discourse. And so some names that trace the shape of this wild otherness is the shadow, the Jungian shadow, the self, beyond's O. And in Lacan, it's traced in the unbearable feelings or vocalizations that slip through when language fails, and in the intolerable numinous. And as the shadow, it's the animal sphere of instinct, is one way that Jung classified this wild otherness, directed towards the inside of things. And this is his concept of the lumen naturae, which is an alternate center of awareness, without which humans lack a three-dimensional aliveness. This is the light embedded in darkness, the light of nature. And so in this particular presentation, I'm going to focus on, I'm going to have a focus on Jung's big S self and the wild ox in the Buddhist 10 oxherding paintings as manifestations of this untamed other within. So let me just say briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with the concept of the self with a big S, the self consists of the entirety of the psyche, conscious and unconscious. It's the ground of being from which the ego emerges and is only a part subsumed within it. And so, but it's more than just that. In a way, it's more than just that. It contains our personal unconscious, but it also contains contents that are beyond that which is mine, collective contents. In some ways, it's the part of us that is more than us. It's the intrapsychic nexus of self and other. And a way we can think of, one way that I suggest we think of the self is the place within where self and other meet. A trans-species, trans-substance nexus through which we can touch the world. And so I'm going to move now into talking a little bit about the oxherding paintings. And you might wonder, what does that have to do with the self with a capital S? And we're gonna kind of unwind the relationship between the ox in these series of paintings that were written, that were painted long ago in the 12th century, and that are an allegory for the process of enlightenment. And so as I'm exploring these oxherding paintings, I'm also going to make some parallels to the individuation process. And I'm going to talk about how inherent in this process of self-realization is a grappling with the relationship with wild alterity. So I'm just going to now go ahead and introduce the oxherding paintings and just give a little bit of background. So there's a 12th century monk, and I know I'm not going to be pronouncing this correctly, named Goan Shion, who revised and expanded upon a traditional Taoist story of the ox and the oxherd by creating a series of 10 images and verses that narrate and depict this well-known tale. And so what we're going to be looking at here is we're going to be looking at the verses written by Goan, but we're going to look at paintings that were painted in 1982 by Master Gyokusei Jikihara, who painted them while he was in residence at New York Zen mountain monastery. So then what is the ox? What is the ox in these Zen ox herding photos? What is happening in this search for the wild ox? And so before I put up the slides, I just want to say a little bit about that. The ox is the mind, the heart, or the self. And so in the Japanese language and in Zen, I'm sorry, not in Japanese, in Chinese language, these are originally in Chinese, the words mind and nature, heart and self are sometimes used interchangeably. And so the sense of mind in this conception is that which encompasses both consciousness and unconsciousness and coincides with what is our nature. And so the ox is also what D.T. Suzuki calls kokoro. And kokoro is a term that describes that which is beyond the fusion of conscious and unconscious, but a kernel of essence that is characterized by emptiness. So this is beyond, in some sense, that's beyond the self, because the self is thought to be the wholeness of consciousness and unconsciousness. However, perhaps it's not beyond the self, because the self also contains more than just the individual unconscious. These terms are all, to some extent, we can blend and meld and feel how they land for us personally. And so one thing that D.T. Suzuki says about kokoro is that kokoro, this emptiness that is also everythingness and is the kernel of essence, wants to know itself. It cannot just remain in emptiness, does not remain in emptiness. And so we can see here the parallel between the self-realization process, the individuation process, where the self is trying to know itself through the mortification of the ego, through the alchemical journey of individuation. And I'll say more about that in a moment. Yeah. So in this series that we're about to see, the ox herd can also be thought of as the ego, the everyday self, the small s self, and he is attempting to relate himself to the elusive Buddha nature in the form of the white ox. And in these images, as in the individuation process, there's a struggle for unification between two beings that might be considered opposite, a boy and a beast, which in a way echoes the dialogical nature of the individuation process. And so yet, and you'll see as I put up the image in just a moment, you'll notice that while there's this, there's a dialogical nature to this process, each image is also encircled. Each image is within a circle, which is an echo of the mandala, a representation of the self. Also, the non-beginning and non-ending nature of eternity, or the Ouroboros. So in this case, the circle is also the greater holding and the unseen presence of what is being sought. And so even though this person is searching for the elusive ox, he's actually always already in the circle of the self or Buddha nature. And I'm just going to say one more thing before I put up those slides. I want to highlight the fact that in these Zen ox herding pictures, the Buddha nature is symbolized by an ox. In some translations, the beast. And it's not symbolized by a man with a white beard. It's symbolized by an ox to represent our true nature. And so we tend to kind of take this for granted or push that to the margins of the conversation. And however, spiritual and mystical qualities have been attributed to animals since ancient times, when animals were painted on the walls of caves, and Egyptian gods and goddesses possessed animal heads and human bodies. Even Jesus is represented as a lamb. And the ox itself is a sacred or totem animal in countless cultures, representing both benevolent and fearsome deities. And so this was before the divine was separated from all that is, was separated from the ground of nature. And humans were the only beings said to be made in his image. And so, like the self, like the divine, animals possess reasons we cannot possess, an orientation that we cannot fully inhabit. Yet, as the deconstructionist philosopher Derrida reports, can look upon us. The animal can look upon us with the eyes of a visionary, a seer, or an extra lucid blind person. And we normally think of ourselves as looking upon the animal, as possessing them. And this entire process that takes place in this oxherding series is, in some sense, like the deconstructionist reversal, a reversal and back again, and a reversal and an integration. So there's so much contained in this. And so one more thing I want to say is that instincts, the idea of instincts being numinous, instincts being one hallmark of the wild self, a cousin of intuition, instincts as the spontaneous precognitive movement of nature, may have the same impulse that drives the self to want to know itself. And the self as a meeting point and mediator between individual and collective, self and other, human and beast, will help us feel into the numinosity of its own movements. So I'm going to now put up a slide. I'm going to just read the verse that goes along with this painting. In the pasture of the world, I endlessly push aside the tall grasses in search of the bull, following unnamed rivers, lost upon the interpenetrating paths of distant mountains, my strength failing and my vitality exhausted, I cannot find the bull. I only hear the locusts chirping through the forest at night. So, and actually, before I even talk about this slide, I want to say that, well, here, I'm going to talk about the slide and then I'll mention it afterwards. This first image recalls the wilderness journey of the dark night of the soul as the individuation process is initiated. And so if there were to be a slide even before this, if we were going to take Edinger's conception of individuation, he believed that before we go in search of the self, before we're cast out of the garden and onto the wilderness journey, we exist in a primordial unity with the self. We exist in an unconscious identification with the wild other that lives through us. And so we can see this in children that really live out wild alterity, that have a natural affinity for animals and who are slowly tamed. So in this stage that's not shown in the oxherding pictures, there's yet no conflict. And so these pictures begin as the ego becomes alienated from the self. It begins with a sense of soul loss, a sense of separation. And so out of this primordial oneness with the wild self, the boy in this image has in a way been cast out of the Garden of Eden. He knows that he's been severed from something vital, and his yearning points him towards the presence of an other within himself, in the world, a wild beingness with whom he couldn't previously relate because he was identified with it, because he was not yet conscious. And so in this yearning and searching, there's an absence that suggests a presence. But at this point in the journey, the boy's only looking outside of himself. And so another way we can think about this searching through the forest, searching through the vines, not being able to see our way into the nature of the self, into true nature, is that we're lost in our contemporary rationalist delusions. The vines of conceptualization have been built up so thickly that we've been separated from the innate and inborn more than human nature, represented as the wild ox. But one thing to note in this image and in the poem is the wild cicadas. The wild cicadas. Even though that's not what he's looking for, we might wonder if there's a way in which the wild other is still calling to him. If that oneness with wild nature is actually all around him. And so we notice in that calling, in the cicadas, in a way, calling to him, calling out. We wonder who has initiated this journey. Has it been initiated by him? Or has he been bitten by the ox? And so with this conception in mind, I'm going to go to the next slide. Now this is the stage of discovering the footprints. Along the riverbank, under the trees, I discover footprints. Even under the fragrant grass, I see his prints. Deep in remote mountains, they are found. These traces can no more be hidden than one's nose looking heavenward. And so one thing I'll say about this image is that in the wilderness journey, this is the stage where the self gives a sign. The ego has exhausted its own resources and needs a clue. And so, and what you'll notice that is in these pictures, there's an emphasis on the boy searching for the ox, but we're going to do a creative reversal here because, as we will see as the pictures progress, there really is no separation between the boy and the ox. We can just as easily say that the ox is leaving signs for the boy. And so while the ox is leaving signs, while he's leaving traces so that the boy does not give up, traces might be thought of as a symbol, as a sign, right? It's not the original wild self. It's still conceptual. It's still theoretical, right? We're seeing a path forward, but we yet have no direct experience and contact with that wild self within, right? And so this is the conceptualization phase. And yet that conceptualization in a way has been fertilized by the wild self. You see that okay? Okay. I hear the song of the nightingale. The sun is warm, the wind is mild, willows are green along the shore. Here no bull can hide. What artist can draw that massive head, those majestic horns? This is perceiving the bull or seeing the bull. And so as it appears, this image is about having a direct experience of the true self, having a direct experience of the wild other within. And so in addition to that, let's just notice that we are confronted with the hindquarters. And so one way we can think about it is that when we first encounter the self, we're confronted with a shadow. The face of the self, the face of the self that we first encounter when we begin the individuation process. And so And what I would say that in showing us the shadow, or in showing us the hindquarters, the part that is usually marginalized, the part that is usually considered less important, that the self or the true nature wants us to know that it is in all things, that it exists in all things, in the dark and in the light, right? In the butterflies and in the piss, right? And so that's one way to conceptualize seeing the hindquarters. Another way to think about it is that when we get a glimpse, a direct experience of the ground of being, the direct experience of the wild alterity of true nature embedded within our own bodies, our first tendency is to latch onto it and make a concept out of it. And this is represented by the sense that this cow is almost segmented and divided and made into a part object, as opposed to a subject with whom we can relate. And so we might even think of the rear quarter of the ox as a certain cut of steak. I don't remember which one it is. And what this maps onto is that when we latch onto a direct experience, when we latch onto an experience of wild alterity, there is a strong impulse to control and tame and corral into our existing paradigms, because right, and it's it's sense something we do so that we can understand it. It's something we can do, something we do because it's a habit, right? But in another sense, what I want to suggest is this is something we do because we are terrified of touching wild otherness. We're terrified of touching something that is wholly other than what we normally experience as mine. In a sense, touching and seeing this ground of being is a threat to the ego. And so the ego jars it the way we would jar a breeze, right? In effect, killing it, making into a part. And so at this point in our journey, the wild nature of the self reflects back to us what we are doing to it and shows us that our mode of relating with it is not yet a true meeting. Okay. Catching the bull. I seize him with a terrific struggle. His great will and power are inexhaustible. He charges to the high plateau far above the cloud mists, where in an impenetrable ravine he stands. I have abandoned the whip and ropes. Okay, so this relationship is evolving, right? So now there is a direct confrontation and meeting with the self, with the wild other. And so in a way, this wrestling with the ox is in a way a subject-object Copernican revolution that's underway. Who is leading whom? Who is dominating whom? Who is determining whom? There's a struggle here, and Edinger notes that the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego, because the self is always, he calls it, brighter and darker than the ego. Right? And so in this struggle, the ego mind is still trying to assimilate the ox into its kind of taming and dominating framework, right? In this confusion about what our relationship needs to be with the parts of me that are not me. with the parts of me that represent all of wild alterity. And so here we are in a way, mishandling our relationship with the ox, trying to wrestle it to fit into our paradigms, treating it as a subject to an object, as opposed to through intimacy, which is a seeing that there is no separation between subject and object. And so in many interpretations of this image, there's like in a traditional Zen training context, we would say that this is the phase of practice where we need more discipline, where we need to use the whip, right? Because in a way, the ox in this sense becomes our unruly mind, right? That needs focus and training. And that it's our job to tame it. But again, I would say that something actually different is happening. That actually the ox is struggling with us because of the way we are relating to it. A way that Jung would say it is that the unconscious turns the face towards us, that we turn toward it. So I'm going to just say here, I'm going to take a moment here to say a little bit more about this struggle from a psychoanalytic lens. I want to say a little bit more about why is it so hard to come into an I-thou relationship with this ox? Why is it so hard to let this ox be an other, as opposed to subsuming it into our systems of measure, into our systems of understanding, into, in a way, consuming and devouring it, so that it becomes incorporated into me? Why is that so hard? And so from the perspective of Lacanian psychoanalysis, the wild ox and wild alterity is an alien presence. It's a voice within me that I cannot even hear properly. And so when we notice impulses and voices, and when we touch that blurry line between self and other, we notice that other actually exists within the self, it's deeply threatening to the ego's sense of unitary wholeness. The ego's relationship to the other within is an ambivalent one, just as humanity's is with nature. And so the ego will alternate between longing for connection with this sort of transverbal wild self, and an attempt to dominate, domesticate, or destroy it. And so this essential ambivalence about alterity, right, is enacted by the self-preserving ego. Right? And so in preemptively imposing meanings on this wild self, we engulf it in what is already knowing, in a way, devouring it. And that devouring is, we're fighting with the ox because we yearn for the ox. It's an act of both aggression and yearning. It's a grappling that is deeply ambivalent. And so one way that David Abram so eloquently describes this is that we cannot abide our vulnerability, our utter dependence upon a world that can eat us. Vast in its analytic and inventive power, modern humanity is crippled by a fear of its own animality and of the animate earth that sustains us. So let's move on from here to the next slide. Taming the bull. The whip and rope are necessary, else he might stray off down some dusty road. Being well trained, he becomes naturally gentle. Then unfettered, he obeys his master. So in this image, we see the boy holding the bull with a loose tether. And as we loosen our grip, as we loosen our dominating impulse, there is a softening in our relationship with the ox. And what I would say is that it is not softening because we've used the whip and the tether. It's softening because we have loosened the tether. It's softening that what we think, and this is a perspective that also often comes up in quantum physics, that when we think that an action, and this is also the basis of dependent co-origination, right? So that what we think is cause and effect, when we think that we cause an action to happen, it's actually not the case. There's a simultaneous co-arising of factors, right? And so we think that because we use the whip and the tether, that this bull has softened. And yet I would say that actually it's softened because we've changed our orientation to it and it to us. And so we think that we're leading the ox, but perhaps it is following us and stalking us, right? Just as Kokoro wants to realize itself. And another verse that sometimes goes with this image is, the animal without a chain, nothing binding, will himself follow the ox herd. Okay. Riding the bull home. I like this image. Mounting the bull slowly, I return homeward. The voice of my flute intones through the evening. Measuring with hand beats the pulsating harmony, I direct the endless rhythm. Whoever hears this melody will join me. It's me. And so in this sort of centaurian image, this shift of power has really been completed. While we might think of riding an animal a dominating act, in this case, this boy has surrendered, or maybe I think he's a man now. It's hard to say. He has allowing himself to be carried by the ox, surrendering to the directionality, trusting the directionality of the wild self. And in playing the flute, no hands on the reins, engaging in a form of wu wei, which is a Taoist term for actionless action without ego. And so he does not need to stay vigilant and protective of those ego boundaries that we just discussed in that psychoanalytic understanding of otherness. There's no longer the survivalist need for control. And because of that, he's free to immerse himself in the call and response with the world. And so I want to say something about playing the flute. This flute playing can be conceived of as a non-verbal, non-conceptual, primordial song. Call and response with the birds. He now speaks the language of the cicadas from the first image. He has become one of them, blurring of subject and object, a nature language. He speaks the language of wild alterity. And I think there's a verse where it says that he has no lips or tongue, which is a reference to he has no need for conceptual thinking. And so he's speaking that sensual language described by David Abram in Spell of the Sensuous. And so just contrast this attitude to some of the common attitudes towards male bovines in the West. We think of bullfighting or the rodeo. We think of industrial farming. Just think about the contrast between this image and this way of relating to wild nature, wild alterity, and that way of nature relating to wild alterity. Let's move on to the next. Astride the bull, I reach home. I am serene. The bull too can rest. The dawn has come. In blissful repose, within my thatched dwelling, I have abandoned the whip and ropes. And so traditionally, this is a stage of Zen practice where we don't need to be so vigilant and to discipline ourselves to use the whip in our practice, but it becomes effortless. And there is also sometimes a poem that goes along with this image that describes that there's no longer a need for net and snares, that the struggle is an illusion. There's no other to struggle with, because wild alterity is simply our nature. There's no other, only us. And so we can put aside all means of control. And so in this sense, true nature as a concept, as an image of the ox, disappears. The ox disappears as an idea, as something we need to search for, and becomes something we simply are. Okay. And so in many versions of the oxherding, in some of the earlier versions of the oxherding pictures, this was the final stage of practice. And this is an image of Buddhist emptiness, the realization of everything and nothing, merging with the dark and bright light of the self, the instinctual, objective psyche. We can think of this in a way as a type of eclipse. Ego and self superimposed on one another, no separation, no forms of objectification. And so in a way, we might think of this as the missing first slide, that when Edinger describes the primordial identification with the self, in a way, this is the individuation process, where we find that through a process of separatio, right? The alchemical separatio. First, we have to be separate from the ox in order to have a relationship with him. And now we've come back again into that primordial unity. There's a complete immersion in relationships such that subject and object disappear. And there's also, let's see, does it say it in this version? Yes, whip, rope, person, and bull all merge in no thing. And so all these beings, animate and inanimate, partake in emptiness. They're all equally part of the 10,000 things, all equally part of Kokoro. And so one of the dangers at this point in the journey is that as of remaining in this re-identification with the self, of dropping out of any sense of indebtedness to the world of relationship, in a way becoming lost again in identification with the self. And so, and teachers often say this is a dangerous place in practice. And so as we go to the final two images, we'll see that we're coming into the hero's journey of coming back into the world. Reaching the source. And so in a way, this image brings to mind the original image where the boy is searching the wilderness, lost in the wilderness. And so in this image, however, we just see nature, we see the tree. And so returning to the world of form, this is the return to the world of form from the place of source of emptiness, returning to the polyphony of wild voices and to the continual process of creation and destruction that is the nature of dependent co-origination. We don't need to disappear. We don't need to identify fully with the wild other in order to find it. We can commune with all 10,000 things with a spark of nature, the lumen naturae in all form, which is right here in our everyday world. And so in a way, we might think of, the way I like to think of this image is that the circle has become the seeker. And so all these 10,000 things are both the wild self, this wild nature we see in this picture is now exists within him. We don't see him because it is him. So this is the stage of attuning to divinity in all form, listening to the forest, listening and clear seeing all animate life. In the world, I think this image is also sometimes called returning to the city, returning to the village with bliss bestowing hands. And in this image, there's been a complete integration of relative and absolute, of form and formlessness, of self and other. And so there's no, as you can see, he has ragged clothes. Oops, I didn't read it. Let me read it. Barefooted and naked of breast, I mingle with the people of the world. My clothes are ragged and dust-laden, and I am ever blissful. I use no magic to extend my life. Now before me, the dead trees become alive. I have abandoned the whips and ropes. So I'll just say a couple of things about this, and then we'll move on. And so as you see the ragged clothes, and you see his lack of possessions, that he's transcended the need to possess the other, to possess a concept, to conceptualize the wild self. He's truly entered into an intersubjective space. Another piece that I might share about this is that he has no more, you can see in the roundness of his belly that he has no more need to satisfy hunger or yearning, that type of orientation towards wild otherness that seeks to consume, dominate, possess, or literalize it. His belly is full and round. In a way, his belly, the circular nature of the belly, suggests the self again, suggests the self-possessed right in his own body as he moves into this kind of diaphragmatic thinking. That self is now where he lives from and what leads him. Not so much the ox leading him now, but his belly is leading him in his own wild animal body. Okay. Stop the share. And I don't want to go on too much longer because I can see that that's taken a bit of time. But I just want to briefly speak to the relationship between tending the numinous, wild otherness within the self and relating to the more than human world. We've talked a little bit, I sort of spoke a little bit about that in the slides, but you know, this fear of the more than human wildness within the self, the untamable horizon, is also revealed in our relationship with a more than human world and non-human animals. And Abram notes this, and I love Abram, obviously, and in his quote, he says that, right, he speaks to the intersection of alienation from the wild self within and with alienation from the more than human world when he says, as technological civilization diminishes the biotic diversity of the earth, language itself is diminished. As we drive more and more of the land's wild voices into the oblivion of extinction, our own languages become increasingly impoverished and weightless, progressively emptied of their earthly resonance. And so our relationship with nature and with non-human animals mirrors our relationship with the intrapsychic wild otherness within us that behaves, that has reasons beyond that which we can possess and that cannot be encompassed by language and dominant discourse. Right, and our relationship, and so what we can see predominantly, although the tide is changing in our relationship with nature and with non-human animals, is the tendency to relate to them through domination, dissection, conceptualization, through dissociative practices that give them names that, such as beef, that speak of killing them as processing, an endless move towards domestication. And so this radical revisioning of relationship with wild alterity that I think is to some extent articulated in the Zen oxherding pictures can also apply to our relationship with nature. And as we befriend the numinous instinctual wild self and learn to relate to it as an I to a thou, we can turn towards the self within us and to all of nature in a much more resourced, powerful, intersubjective way that also allows us to thrive, that also allows us to, right? Because that self, that animal outside is not actually different from the wild self inside. That numinosity, numinosity exists both in self and other. And so when we dissect, dominate, violate nature and non-humans outside, we are simultaneously doing that to our own internal alterity. And so I would like to end this with a personal revisioning of a popular meditation technique. And so it's common in for certain meditation teachers to describe meditation as training the puppy. When we bring thoughts back, like the puppy wanders off, very similar to the oxherding pictures in a way. The puppy wanders off, and we invite the puppy back. We tell the puppy to come back. We're kind to the puppy, right? In these modern meditation circles, we're not using a whip with the puppy, with a mind puppy. However, there is implicit in this conceptualization of meditation of domestication and dominance. There's a trace of domestication and dominance, right? That the mind puppy, that the mind weeds are somehow ours to control, that they don't possess the numinosity of the wild self. And so what if we instead thought of meditation, instead of training the puppy, as befriending the wolf, where we come into relationship with all that exists within us, where we create a safe space, a field of stillness, kindness, openness, and honoring that allows whatever wild weeds and wild creatures exist within us to feel safe to come forward, and in coming forward can actually claim their place as a numinous element of the wild psyche, as an essential element of the wild psyche. What if every thought, every impulse, actually, when we make a space for it to come forward, when we befriend that wolf, when we sit with open arms, just witnessing as an I to a thou, whatever comes forth within us, what if that's what meditation is? And I will end there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sara. Beautiful presentation. And I really love the use of the images, especially as we are getting beyond conceptual thinking and allowing image to help take us to those places, as well as your evocation of like a sonic ecology, the flute, the primordial song, and the polyphony of voices. Again, really strong concepts that for me anyway, they really do activate that kind of that zone of liminality. But I'd like to open it to the floor for questions. Anybody who would like to ask a question or if they have a comment, please do type it into the chat if you'd like, or raise your hand. And I hope I don't have to say, don't be shy. Christopher.
Hello, everyone, and Sarah, thank you for that. Yeah, I just a little background. I'm at Meridian University and about to start my dissertation, and my topic, I was like, you stole my topic. Not really, but so thank you for sharing everything you have. And what comes to mind to me that I wanted to ask about is like your final statement about befriending the wolf, and a question around like, I don't know how in relationship to this wild alterity, like the idea of safety, and can it ever really be safe, or I'm like a kind of maybe care in that sense of when you talk about sort of taming through conceptualization, and yeah, and thinking about things in the wilderness, like fires or things like this. They're not convenient. We don't like them in an immediate sense, but the befriending that you're speaking to, does that allow space for being challenged, being maybe even defeated by the wild sometimes? So if you have anything to share on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just sort of sitting with a word that you used at the beginning about safety. And I was just wondering if you could say a little more about what that word meant to you in that context and what your thoughts are around safety?
Yeah, I guess sometimes for me, safety can mean to like a wall to a city, to keep what is within safe from the wild of the outside.
Yeah. So you're sort of, how do we reconcile like maybe a evolutionary, like survivalist, that some of this separation from the wild self might have an evolutionary purpose, might also have a psychological purpose, right? To shield us from the kind of unbearable numinous, and from the, right, and from, in some sense, the impersonal wild unfolding of nature and in the world. And so, and you also asked, does it allow one to be sort of defeated? Is that something that you said at the end? Befriending?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think you're pointing to something important in a way, that it's not just befriending is that maybe a catch-all term that doesn't quite capture the dynamism of the evolving relationship with wild otherness. And certainly I think that in some sense, the purpose of the ego is self-preservation, and the ego will do its job, right? In friendship. And I don't think friendship means being totally overtaken in a way, right? I don't think friendship means, and we might be overtaken. And I think that's part of what happens in the dark night journey of the individuation process, where in a way we have to go through an experience of being humbled by the wild self. But that's actually part of a corrective. Like that's part of a corrective that actually makes space for us to come into a befriending oriented, like that. Without that corrective of being defeated, we can't really come to know it as a true other. I think that's what I would say. I don't know if that speaks to what you were asking.
Yeah, and I'm left with like maybe what is a truer, deeper sense of friendship and the humility and defeat that can be all involved in that, and the back and forth there in friendship. So I appreciate that
Yeah,
metaphor.
great. That's a great inquiry. Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much more. I mean, there's so much more that I had so many pages of notes, and the last minute I was just like, there's no way I can talk about all this, because there's just so much that can be said about these images, about, you know, I'm in the process of kind of doing a conjunctio of all these disparate elements. And so I think that inquiry is a whole other inquiry that would be so valuable to go deeper into. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Should I call on people, or are you going to?
Sure. Yeah, Helge, please.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for your lovely presentation. I appreciate your clarity and creative precision with how you're unfolding the images. One aspect that I'd like to comment on or hear your thoughts also on, a few years ago, a TA who was Chinese culturally and Chinese speaking and a linguistics background brought up into the conversation about the images that in Chinese culture, the ox is symbolically sort of perceived often, you know, not as much of a wild beast. And sure, in the pictures there's this sort of progression towards searching, befriending, taming, relating, and all of that. But she said it's interesting because in Chinese culture in general, the ox is sort of an agricultural animal. It's honest, reliable, trustworthy, loyal, and all of that, which, you know, thinking about that as another aspect and thinking about the unconscious or the self, as here's my question, you know, in a way, is this a particularly Western way of perceiving the bull or the ox as this sort of wild, unruly other, that sort of beast-like nature that needs to be feared and conquered and dominated potentially? And what happens if we consider it as this sort of loyal, trusted, reliable, sturdy animal? What changes there? So I don't know if you have some thoughts playing with that idea. I found that very interesting.
That's interesting. Thank you. Well, what comes to mind when you share that is that perhaps in a way, both of those attributes, the kind of almost like the loyal, trusting, protective, and the kind of wild and almost daimonic, or the maybe the dark side of the Godhead, like that these could both be attributes of the self, right? That I think there's space for both of those natures in the ox. It may be that I am superimposing, you know, or amplifying the sense of wildness that sort of, but I do think that there is implicit in even in the original pictures and in the original verses, a sense that this ox is actually, you know, even in the struggle with the ox, you can see that the ox is not actually yielding. The ox is not, I mean, it may be my Western interpretation, but I think it's, and that the ox is wandering, the ox is not yielding, the ox is needing the whip. And so in a way, I might think of it that perhaps in, you know, in traditional cultural conceptions of the ox might be as a domesticated animal. Perhaps this image of the wild ox is like it parallels our own primordial nature. Like it's almost like This is before the ox is wild. It's like before we got domesticated as well. This is going back to before the ox became that, that loyal servant, right? That we're actually working with the raw kind of that prima materia, right, of the ox, just like we're working with that prima materia of ourselves. So that's, I don't know, those are some thoughts I have on that.
Great, thank you. And of course, the wildness is sort of in the foreground, right? Or the need to tame, or the stubbornness and elusiveness of it all. They're clearly there, but I thought this other side to it, sort of an interesting complementary feature of it all. What if, right? There's really this sort of loyal, reliable piece in there somewhere too. Yeah. Thank you for your thoughts.
Right, and maybe that loyal reliability also comes from the forging of the refinement of the relationship, and maybe that originally came from that. Even like I think it's a different type of relationship I'm thinking about in terms of the ox as a worker and the ox in these images, but anyway, that's just another lens. Thank you. Deb Sheesh.
Yeah, thank you, Sara. I enjoyed the talk very much, and particularly the width of references you brought into it. I think you slipped in Derrida, and you slipped in, the various kinds of alchemical psychoanalysis, Lacan, people like that. I think those who want to read between the lines could have got a lot of those notes that you never shared, I think. So that was great. One of the things that I was noticing, of course, June is also here. June and I teach a course on Zen texts and Zen art. And one of the things I was noticing is the gap between the text, the art, and the interpretation. And I think that's great. That's the point. It also relates to what Helga was saying, that you're using the text and the images to make a certain kind of interpretation, which is contemporary, necessary to our times, and that really opens up the door to a new activism. And I think, this is really a comment that I think, to point to those gaps, I was looking at the art actually, and Gokusei is interpreting the text. There are subtle differences between the text and the art, and then you're interpreting that in a way which is very interesting. And I think you interpreted it very beautifully, because you made judicious use of the pointers that supported your interpretation. So that was great. Yeah. Now, my question relates to the fact that I was thinking also about theological models, that, the Buddhist theological model, the model of shunyata, is a model that has no idea of ontological evil in it. That there is, there can be, for example, relative evil. In other words, we sort of attribute evil to things that we can't measure up to. And there can be ontological evil. In other words, there can be models where evil exists so long as the world exists, or evil exists to be transformed at a cosmic level beyond human possibility. What would you say about that with respect to these images and this kind of, maybe to some extent also relates to the question of safety? Is there the possibility of forces that are cosmic, that are antagonistic to our existence, that becoming friendly to, is maybe a good idea, but not possible? Or what would you say to that view?
So you're sort of speaking to that that like the shadow side of wild alterity, like the shadow side of the self in a way, you know, what do we also befriend that? Yeah,
To
if
what
that,
extent? Yeah, to what extent?
Mhm,
And also, of course, the shadow side is also a model. I mean, it's the Jungian model of the self.
right.
To what extent does it integrate, let's say, the idea of some kind of a devil or a Satan? Most of the Eastern models don't include the idea of a devil or a Satan. That is, you know, the Ahriman of the, sort of Zoroastrian model that is constantly at war, and that can be, you know, kept at bay, but you can develop certain types of relations with it, but it's too big, too cosmic. Only God can fight it, or something like that.
Mm, mm, mm. And in a way, are you asking how do we like, how do we discern whether or not we're working with that, like as we're working with the self? Is that part of the question?
Yeah. I mean, exactly. Oh, maybe that's why I brought up the notion of relative and ontological, because for us, without knowing, it's only a model. You know, all these are just models. But in practically speaking, I guess we are sometimes up against these forces. The wild other, the bull. In fact, the ox or the bull. You mentioned the idea of the bull in bullfighting. I thought that was a great connection. But you find it pervasively. You find it in the Indus Valley. You find bullfighting there. You also find these images throughout Indian art of, yogi figures who protect weak animals against tigers and bulls, and who create a safe space sometimes in which all these animals can coexist. You know, the tiger sleeping with the lamb, the wisdom of these yogis that is heard by all these people at the same time. So getting to a point where that is possible, I mean, it also requires a certain kind of a relative understanding of the bounds or the boundaries of one's limits in dealing with these things. That's probably where I was coming from.
Right. Well, I think, both you and Christopher, in a way, like bringing up such a important point about like what is befriending consist of, and is that, and so it may be that term in a way is a little bit it's sort of an overdetermined term. I think that term maybe doesn't quite encompass, right, what you're describing, that there's actually that each, that all the 10,000 things might each require their own kind of relationship. And so I think that what, I might say that maybe what's important here is it's not, maybe it doesn't always look like befriending, right, having as a friend in the traditional sense, but maybe it's more about creating an I-thou relationship. An I-thou relationship doesn't necessarily have to, has to entail friendship per se in the way we traditionally think of it, right? But in that I-thou relationship, I was watching earlier today. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the image of this woman who's an animal communicator, and she talks to a black jaguar that was named Diablo. I don't know if any of you have seen this. It's a really amazing video. She's like a psychic animal communicator, and she sits there with all these, this black jaguar was like, he was in a big cat sanctuary, and he was so angry, he wouldn't leave his night enclosure, and he was snarling at everybody who came by. And she sat, and she had this way of just sitting with all different kinds of creatures, where she was just, she received, she was receiving him, right? She was absolutely creating this space within for this black jaguar or leopard, I forget, jaguar named Diablo to come forward. And because she's an animal communicator, then she would see images, like he would show her like what he was going through. She would see it as images. And so I just thought that she may not be, and what she found out is this black jaguar didn't really want contact with people. That this black jaguar actually, because I think he had been kind of like in a circus environment or something like that, he really wanted to have his own space to be left alone. But this woman is somehow able to make herself into a receiver for the subjectivity, of animals. And so I think that maybe this is a funny way to answer your question, but I think that it is like in tuning into like the wild other as a thou, we really have the chance to meet them as they are, right? And to honor kind of what they need for their own specific, each unfolding and realization.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think that makes complete sense. Yeah, I think it's an attunement and an intimacy that that brings a certain kind of a knowledge, that tells us what the relationship should be.
Yeah, I love that word, intimacy. I think that's that just like hits right on the spot. That really lands it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Chris.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I agreed with the previous questioner on the breadth of stuff you did. I thought it was really helpful, sort of showing how all these different thought processes sort of generally point in that same direction. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to, and maybe I missed this sort of at the beginning, to the sort of collective or social sort of other side of wildness. When I sort of think of wildness, I sort of think of its dialectical opposite as being society, the collection of egos together, which it's interesting to me that many of the alchemical and sort of spiritual traditions treat the process as a very sort of solitary endeavor, which of course is a very individuation, solitary part of it. And yet many of the challenges that come up in that process, whether practical or super ego wise, are the how are other people going to perceive me. And I think it's interesting the way, like, even the model of like the ox, as a farm animal, was sort of part of this construct of society that does things. And I'm sort of curious how you think about that, how it fits in on any level that sort of seems right to you around around that.
I mean, sort of like how collectively, like what it looks like to be kind of dissociated from the wild self on a collective level, how that manifests, or
more just like the role of the society in which we live, how that fits in with that process of individuation, because even at the end, like, it doesn't become this sort of purely individual person living on a mountaintop. He's back in the town as part of it. And so his connection with his wild self has also changed his relationship to the broader societal context in which he finds himself.
Not sure. Do you have any initial thoughts on that? I'm curious if you, it sounds like you're cooking up something. And I also see Audrey's hand. I'm going to sit with that for a moment.
Yeah, it's a question I've been chewing on for sort of years as I've been sort of exploring, alchemy and psychoanalysis and whatnot, that it feels like this sort of missing dimension of the analysis, and I can't really figure out how, like, the other's other fits into it. Like, to sort of use the simplest analysis, if I'm having a relationship with somebody else, there's like my ego and my sort of you do, and then there's them and their do, and so there's actually this like four entity at a minimum, interaction that seems like a sort of critical part of understanding even myself, because myself as a individual sort of also exists within this context of other selves. That seems important to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I guess one, and I do want to hear from Audrey too, because I saw your hand up. One thought I have on that is that I think this process of coming into contact with wild alterity and coming into a deeper relationship with otherness is does relate to our relationship with others, and how do we hold others? Do we, and in some ways, there may be some models like of couples counseling, right? That helps us, learn how do we relate to our partner as a whole being with their own unknowable alterity. So often when we pair up with someone, it's like we just sort of, merge with them, or we sort of assume, we sort of place them into our paradigm of like, and that might be one way, one way of saying that might be projection. One way of talking about that might be an archetypal template. But when we're in relationship with someone, we tend to place them in the paradigm, our existing conceptual paradigm of what relationship is, what an action is, what. And so in a way, we're not guarding their kind of wild aloneness and their otherness. And I think that coming into that, almost like the separatio of relationship, like really like being able to step back in a way allows us then to come into that deeper intimacy. So that's, I think you're also talking maybe about a broader collective level, and I think that's super important, but I have to think about that more. So that's one thought I have about what you're sharing.
Well, thank you. I'll look into that concept of separatio. I think that's an interesting avenue to explore. So, thank you.
Thanks. And Audrey, did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, that's so. Oh, I thought Chris just left. Thank you, Sarah. It's so cool to see you in real time. I'm so glad I got to jump in last minute.
Yay.
Thank you.
Hi.
Yeah, I was just gonna say what popped into my mind about thinking about that dichotomy between the wild and the village, or the wild and the city. I'm super influenced by two myth tellers, Dr. Martin Shaw and Daniel Deerdorf. And there's an amazing concept that they have, that culture cannot come from the center. It cannot come from the city, from the village, that we need to have a relationship with the wild, with the marginal, with the medial, the edge spaces, and that we need to go back and forth. And so it's never just, right, the hero's journey and it ends. It's this, literally this leaping consciousness in and out, especially because often, right, we find ourselves in the center, perhaps because of information and inspiration that came from the wild. And then we're suddenly in the center, we're exalted, we're sharing ourselves, but then we lose that connection. We forgot where it came from. So we need to be wandering back and forth. So that's what I just wanted to kind of offer on that, with the whole thing about the center and the edge, the center and the edge. Yeah, totally. Like a like a pendulum. And then I guess the other thing I was thinking from the previous comment is just like, I think separating what we're talking about here, right? That like, is the wild actually the shadow? For me, the wild is the most ancient self, the truest self, the most, in the thing that informs us the most. I also would say, I was thinking as the other comment was coming in, was for me, this is just like what I've learned in my own body, my own experience, is that there's a duality, and there's light and dark, and the shadow is a part of that, but the shadow is redeemable. I do not believe that the shadow is evil or predatory. I believe that the predatory energy is something else entirely. So I think, to keep in mind of like, there are this multiplicity of parts here, and kind of, where are we ascribing the wild? Where are we ascribing the otherness? Because I definitely do not, the shadow is redeemable. The dark is redeemable. The dark is part of a necessity of the light. So thanks for all the good trouble. Good trouble is my favorite thing.
Thank you, Audrey. I love your comment about, coming back and forth from the margins. I think that's such an important point, right? How that, and in a way, it kind of echoes, the spiral journey of the individuation process, and in a way, the oxherding, sort of having two distinct phases, right? Where we are identified, we come into the wilderness on the search, we're identified again, we have to kind of go back into the world. And so there's some of that back and forth process is echoed in there. And then in terms of the wild self, I totally agree. I don't think that the wild self is like reducible to the shadow. I think that we can find traces of the wild self you know, amongst all of these different archetypes. I think that in some ways, you know, and there's different ways that people define and hold the shadow, right? Some people really hold the shadow as a kind of vast other center of awareness. But I think that absolutely, in a way, the wildness, right, encompasses all of these archetypes within it as it traces or express. So thank you. Yes. Lucia. Oh, I think maybe you're muted. Still can't hear you. No. Darn.
Lucia, you could try jumping off and coming back on. Sometimes audio settings are just not right when you enter.
Or you can always throw it in the chat.
True.
Yeah, sorry.
Is there any other questions while Lucia may be typing something in the chat? I mean, we're at an hour and a half, and we don't want to go too much longer, but we've definitely opened up a lot of really big questions and important questions. Well, maybe I could jump in for a second, Sara. I mean, I already had, you know, in the beginning commented on the importance of the art in your talk, bringing that, the images. And it was interesting because I really felt that tension of a kind of a paradoxical tension throughout the talk, because it seemed as though the images were activating me in a certain way. And the talk was in a different way. And like, you know, there was this kind of, you know, based on thinkers you were using, like the models, as well as just language in itself, it lends itself to kind of a binary, you know. And so some of the ideas of like the self with a small s and a big S, or some of the other binaries that were coming up, conscious, unconscious, that leads to a certain kind of way of activating, you know, identifying forces, insides and outside, centers and edges and stuff like that. It's all really important and strategic in activism and in individuation. But I really did feel that tension in terms of the images, which really they don't seem to work in me in that way at all. And especially, you know, bringing the enso as like the, you know, beyond an archetypal image of non-duality in a sense. But I guess that was the question, is that there's these two threads, and you know, you said at one point how we need to think the self and the ox at the same time, you know. And so there is this extremely strong sense of non-duality, but individuation is in time, it is in process. And so again, that theme of individuation. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more on the role of integration, and maybe based on my theme of being temporality itself, because that's where I think that there are certain notions of individuation which depend on a linear sense of temporality, and yet there are these images that seem to take me right out of that in many ways. And so like, it seems as though putting these two thinkers together, like Jung and Zen, for instance, it's that you are demanding a rethinking of individuation based on knowing it in temporality and in atemporality, you know. And I guess that was just that just more thoughts on that, like, you know, what also just an extension of that, what are ways in your research have you found that these two models are not compatible, you know, or how have you had to extend like a model, like, you know, in terms of Jung's idea of individuation and its compatibility or non-compatibility with a Zen idea, you know, of becoming, right? And I guess that's where it's like that there's definitely a tension, a healthy tension, I think, because it raises a lot of good questions. And like I said, the art, it sort of, it activates these ideas in a way that really, it helped me get beyond a binary or a way of thinking individuation, which is kind of bound to the idea of a prescription of like self-making, a making of the self with a capital S, something that is, you know, that can be very easily tied to an ideological telos or something, you know. So just some thoughts along those lines.
Yeah, those are great thoughts. Just feeling into what I have to add to that. I mean, I appreciate, yeah, I mean, I think that in a way, I'm curious when you said that so you're saying that your experience of the images was not so binary, that you had and that some of my talk kind of discussed a lot of, you know, put a lot of different concepts next to each other and talked about a lot of kind of opposites, right, as well as corollaries. And yeah, I think that it's certainly, you know, what I was doing is not in the original spirit, right, of the Zen oxherding pictures. You know, I think you're picking up on something important, right? It's not seeking to kind of reify and define these binaries, right? But I think that what felt powerful to me was feeling into some of the, well, for sure, there are definitely differences, you know, in the Jungian individuation process and the process of self-realization. I think that they also have a lot of very kind of powerful parallels. And because any of the names that we give these forces and give these you know, archetypes, concepts, no self, kokoro, the self, all of them are going to be, to whatever extent, like incomplete, right, over-determined. There's no way, because it's all conceptual, right? In some sense, I don't want to say we get to decide, but I think it's very much a process of feeling through, like the felt sense of the parallels between these concepts. I think that, you know, for certainly in Jungian psychology, there's not an emphasis on this idea of kokoro, of emptiness and no self, right? But I wouldn't, and there's also a difference in that, you know, the process, like the meditative process is might be considered very different. But I think part of what I wanted to do actually at the end of my talk was suggest maybe they're not as different as we might think. We might traditionally think of Zazen, right? The process of Zen meditation as being that of really just like letting thoughts fall away, really like, you know, focusing on the breath or just focusing on the ground of being. And whereas in Jungian analysis, we're really turning towards all the images, right? We're going towards and allowing the wild alterity of the unconscious through free association to speak to us and inform us. In the way that I practice Zazen, I think it's actually a little bit closer than some of the traditional conceptions might suggest. The way that I practice Zazen is a complete allowing. It's a complete action of, in a way, befriending the wolf, right? Of turning towards gently, allowing the stream of images and concepts to come through me. I might not, in the same way in Jungian analysis, where we might hang on and want to make a myth, I might not do that. So there might be a different relationship about our role in the process. In the Buddhist thought, I think it's much less of, it's not that we need to do anything, right, with those images that come through. But in another sense, in archetypal psychology, like in the Hillman approach, there's something similar. Like we let the images speak for themselves. we let the images exist on their own terms. So in that kind of frame, I actually am not 100% convinced that they're as different as we might initially mean them to be. And also with the meeting of East and West, like with so many people that are now practicing both of these different forms of like psycho-spiritual practice or spiritual practice, I think there's also like these practices themselves are alive, and they're emerging and changing as our relationship with them and with each other changes. So I think that's all I have right now.
Yes, beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
If there's any last burning questions, we'll take them now.
This isn't a question so much, but I was just curious because of how you used the wolf. And I was like, I wonder what would happen if you contemplated the pictorials and just replaced the bull with the wolf and see if anything would change and how they progressed. Just curiosity.
That sounds like a project for somebody. That sounds really powerful. I think that I wouldn't know until the wolf spoke to me through those images. Thank you.
Yeah, super creative. Well, on that note, that's a project for everybody. Report back soon if you make it.
Please let me know if someone undertakes that.
Yeah. But thank you so much, Sara, for being with us. This has been a fantastic, talk and discussion. We will be releasing this on YouTube. And we also, Stefan and I, who host the East-West Psychology podcast, will be looking forward to doing a podcast with you in which we'll be exploring your work in other ways than tonight. But we look forward to that. And I also recommend people, if they haven't, to check out that podcast. But thanks everybody for being here. Our next talk is, when is it here? April 13th, 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. It's with Glenn Aparico Perry, who is going to be teaching in our East-West Psychology department in the coming semester. So you'll get a chance to meet him and get to become a little more familiar with his work if you're not. I highly recommend coming. I'll be here. Stefan will hopefully be here. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. Bye.